Yeah, we're all good to go.
Hey, all right. So we are here today to talk about two albums that are critically acclaimed, highly influential, and made by two of the biggest hip hop artists right now. Or
I think so. Yeah, I think they're two pretty big name big name artists.
all right. So we'll be talking about My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy by Kanye West
Heard of that one.
and To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar.
Heard of that one too.
Yes. All right. So let's start this off, Kenny. So, what do you got to say about it? What's the first question you want to ask about both of these works?
Ooh, I mean, that's so much we can go into. I mean, the biggest thing about the both of them is that I feel like both of them weren't just albums when they came out. They were kind of a part of like cultural moments, or they were very significant artistic achievements. And I kind of feel like it wasn't just like these albums came and it was like, oh, that was a good record. That's some good songs. It almost kind of like set the tone and kind of reformed the conversation about music going forward. So I feel like the best place to start with either record is like, how did you feel personally as like a consumer of hip hop and music? How did you feel when both these records kind of hit the scene, and what was the impact? Because from my personal experience, like I noticed a lot of changes in the scene, and what I noticed music was after I heard the both of these.
First of all, I could say that I remember more of the anticipation for To Pimp a Butterfly that was released latest compared to My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Pimp a Butterfly was around 2015, I believe, it was released.
That's
Uh,
2015, yeah.
yeah, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy was, I think, fall of 2010, something like that.
2010, yep. Actually,
So it's
fun
been like a
fact, came out
good.
on my birthday.
It came out on your birthday.
It came out on my birthday, yep.
Wow, that's that is
It's
a very
Kanye's
pleasant
gift to me.
a very pleasant birthday gift for you. I remember specifically where I was when Pimp a Butterfly was released because I remember one of my friends, Tennessee, we were celebrating his 21st birthday in the Poconos. So it was around March of 2015. I remember it was also spring break too, leaving college, going to the Poconos like for the first few days of spring break. And then I remember just looking on my phone, forgot where I read it, probably on Facebook or something. And they're saying that, oh, To Pimp a Butterfly is going to be released on iTunes. And I was like, oh shit, new Kendrick album is coming out now. And then I remember, I forgot him. I think one of my friends, I think they bought it just right on the spot. And we just like listened to it. Listening to that album at first, like there's a lot that's going on. Cause
Oh,
one,
a ton.
you're just going in blindly and you're not really expecting this kind of album really to hear this kind of album coming out of Kendrick Lamar, because To Pimp a Butterfly is more of like jazz, funk,
Oh yeah,
hip hop,
soul.
all mixed soul.
Yeah,
Yeah, just it's some
everything.
completely out of left field, especially coming from Good Kid, Mad City, which is I would say is like a traditional, hip hop album, concept album,
Yeah, way
where
more storytelling
yeah,
driven for sure.
really big storytelling basically is like the day in the life of Kendrick Lamar growing up in Compton. But this album To Pimp a Butterfly, it's like completely different conceptually, definitely sonically too, in the terms of production and sound. There was a lot to digest at first because it's like a very, like I said, jazzy album, funk, soul, and just much like jazz, how jazz is very heavy and free form and at times chaotic in a way. That's kind of
Yeah.
how To Pimp a Butterfly sounded to me at first because it's just all these sounds you just have to digest and just having to connect the messages too along with the music, which perfectly aligns with one another. The messages on To Pimp a Butterfly is, has to do a lot about race.
Race,
It's
institutional
race,
racism, violence,
yeah,
poverty,
exactly.
class.
Institutional racism, classism, basically, trying to escape from the hood in Kendrick Lamar's sense and becoming successful and then coming back there and being a successful artist and just identifying all the obstacles that people of lower socioeconomical class and race to having to deal with society at the time, or you could say still
Mhm.
today, really. A lot of heavy themes that we'll definitely tackle later on, but yeah, there's a
Yeah, I
lot
mean,
to
it just
talk
album has a lot of subtext
with
for sure.
that album alone. If we talk about My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, yeah, I was literally maybe 17 when that album came out, I want to say. Yeah, because I was fall
Yeah, I
time.
think I was 15, 16 when it came out. Yeah, I was pretty young.
It was like my senior year, I'm pretty sure. I don't really remember too much of my initial, hype and reactions behind it. All I know
Mhm.
is the stuff that was leading up to this album being released. All I remember, I think everyone would say, is before the events of this album, this was the one where Kanye went on the VMA stage, stole the mic from Taylor
That was an
Swift,
incident. Yeah, the
claimed
whole
that
shebang.
Beyonce had the greatest music video
Video
of
of
all
all
time,
time.
and just the public and the media just like shaming this guy. And
Yeah, he was down and out for like a year.
yeah, he basically went into exile in a way. He was shunned, um, went to Hawaii, locked himself up, and recorded this album. He created basically one of the best pieces of modern music, you could say.
Yeah,
Um,
I've regardless of what you think of him, I mean, the album it's timeless. I mean, I think a lot of artists and albums take a lot from Dark Fantasy's playbook and still are to this day.
yeah, it's kind of crazy to believe how a lot of artists from so many different genres like just claim Kanye as someone who they look as like an influence or
Yeah, not even rap. Like a lot of like R&B or alternative or even rock artists. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. It kind of set like what we were saying earlier. It set a template, I think, for a lot of like the aesthetic of modern rap. And I feel like it's crazy. Like 10 years later, that Dark Fantasy. It's not like it's like, oh, like that was a trend. Like that's still the model for a lot of records. And I think some people like Childish Gambino, like because of the internet, like you see a lot of records. It's like that idea of like an epic artistic statement. I mean, that kind of came from that to an extent.
totally, yeah, yeah, definitely with Dark Twisted Fantasy, it really, it stuck with like as a concept kind of progressive art rap project. Really, you could say it's kind of like a rap opera album
You
because it
know,
does like tie in those
it's
themes of
enough drama to
yeah,
just to justify that.
exactly. And it does have like those themes of just very grand themes, really, just like of
Oh,
excess and power
extravagant.
and celebrity, and then having to deal with like it also coming on with like the whole concept and themes. It's kind of like falling from grace in a way and going through all these troubles, personal issues and stuff, which is very relatable to
Hmm.
what Kanye West was really going through at the time, because
Oh
it's
yeah, it's deeply
you know
personal in like a weird
yeah,
way.
because yeah, like I said, the guy went through a lot of stuff after that whole VMAs incident, and was a pariah basically. And
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh,
I
that's
think
incredibly accurate.
it definitely ties into the whole themes of excess, because you have Kanye West, who's very boastful and braggadocious, and who is thinks very highly of himself and his abilities as a rapper and artist. Some of the songs on there that talk about excess, like Power. That's like the one song that
Yeah,
you could
power.
point to, is like how someone could be the king and on top of things, and then just fall from grace just like that, really.
Yeah, I mean,
Mm.
I think you analyze both albums pretty accurately in terms of the context and the impact. I think that what's crazy about the Pimp a Butterfly is that you were kind of saying like it kind of came out of the blue a little bit. I don't know if anybody really anticipated it to be as much of like a artistic statement, because I feel like you look at Pimp a Butterfly and people are writing essays about it. I see all these
Mhm.
articles talking about how it's still relevant with George Floyd and all of these social and political issues. Like when it first came out for me, I thought, oh, new Kendrick music, it's gonna be great. It's gonna be like good lyrics, good beats, but I didn't think it was gonna be a statement about America and the world we're living in, and that it was still, what is it, 6 years later, it's probably even more relevant. It could have been put out today or last week or last month or last year. So it's crazy to see how these albums, I mean, they're very different on the surface, but in both ways, it's almost kind of they're the deepest reflections, I think, of their respective artists in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, totally. I know like during that time they were starting to have like protests like throughout the country because of police brutality. Michael Brown comes to mind, Trayvon Martin during those
Eric Gardner,
times.
yeah, right at
Yeah,
that time.
there's police brutality going on, so it did really tie in well too. But yeah, like I was saying, that you didn't really expect like Kendrick Lamar to come out with an album that really talks about those deep issues about society like that. And yeah,
No,
I agree that, he could release this album today or tomorrow and it would still be very impactful and still very relevant today. So timing wise, it worked back then. And I don't really see it as an album that, is only reflective of a specific time. It's timeless. It's still, like I said, relevant and just explains a lot what's going on today too. So, or
yeah,
what's been
and I
going
think
on in the past year also specifically.
yeah. Oh my God,
Yeah.
it's crazy. I mean, I listened to it, I mean, recently for this, and a lot of the tracks and the themes when you hear a song like "All Right," and I mean, it's like talking about dark times and brutality and racism and the stigmas that are going around, and it's you see what happens. Not to get too topical, but you see what's been happening throughout the year, and that song, that could be a song for this week or this month, and it's crazy to me. I think that great art is something that you can put it on any day, any time, any place, and it'll have appeal and resonance. And I think Pimp Butterfly, I mean, nails that factor from top to bottom.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. It's like literally you look at videos of protests and stuff and you still hear in the backgrounds like they're playing, that song All Right, or you hear them chanting we gonna be all right, basically. So it's really that song in particular also is a highlight and something that's still relevant message till to this day.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're talking about impact and influence. I think Pimp a Butterfly's influence is a bit more obvious in terms of the social and cultural level. Where do you see the influence of dark fantasy in today's music? Like, since that record came out, how much of that are you seeing in current music and current aesthetics? I feel like a lot of it is maybe not as obvious in terms of that, but it's very obvious, I think, in terms of the musical choices and the influence and the way the artists kind of approach albums. I think dark fantasy definitely set a tone for that.
Yeah, I think with Dark Twisted Fantasy, I think Kanye kind of set a standard of how big an album could be and how big it could sound. And I think a lot of artists today mimic that or try to kind of reach that kind of standard in terms of how an album should sound and how songs tie into one another. And also just the whole, quality of the tracks too, because in my opinion, I don't think there really is a song on here that I would skip. There's a lot that was put into like each
Oh yeah,
individual
the
track.
craft
Really.
is
Yeah.
impeccable.
I have a friend of mine who I remember I was talking about this album with him maybe a few years ago. And he was saying that, yeah, Dark Twisted Fantasy is such a great album, but in his opinion, he thought it sounded too overproduced. Like, which I kind of agree in a sense because it's like,
Maybe
there's a lot, yeah, like I said, there's a lot of production in there, and it's just like just when you like hear the songs, big production, orchestras, all these
oh
horns,
yeah,
strings,
the arrangements are massive. The
arrangements
samples,
are crazy. And just when you think
absolutely.
the song's over, a lot of songs like at the end, they just hit you with more things too. Like there's outros to these songs too, which are crazy, like
Oh yeah,
just
yeah.
crazy arrangements and production. Just when you think this grand song is over, it's just going to hit you with more stuff. For example, let's see what we have here. Like Runaway, that's
Yeah,
already,
Runaway was the example I was gonna point to.
yeah,
I mean,
like
that's a
that's
jam-packed
like
track.
one of the most iconic songs in the past 10 years, I would say.
Oh, completely,
um
completely.
Starting with the whole intro, which is identifiable. You hear those piano notes, you already know what song it's going to be.
Yeah, it's very FX Twin with the very skeletal pianos and the chords and the progressions. Yeah, it's different. I wasn't expecting
Yeah,
a Kanye song like that, and I was a longtime fan at the time too.
exactly. And that song is 9 minutes. So, any song that's kind of long like that, it's already going to be big
Oh yeah, yeah. It's gotta
sound.
earn
There
those
isn't
9 minutes.
really like, you don't hear any long songs that don't have like a big grand sound to it, really.
No. I hope not. I
Yeah.
hope not.
But I know it's like after the whole like Pusha T verse ends and then there's the split and gets like the whole just the the string arrangements going on, and then the whole auto-tune outro, which is another, it feels like that could be an interlude or a song in itself.
Yeah.
The outros to a lot of these songs really give it a big grand sound. Same with Power too. Just when you think Power is just going to end, it switches up a bit and just kind of gets this grand ending to it too.
Yeah, very orchestral. Yeah, with the choruses, and yeah, I mean, Dark Fantasy is full of that, and it's. I like how you mentioned how layered it was, because when I first heard it, I mean, obviously I knew who Kanye was. I'd heard his records, but it's an album that I think really, I've almost been calling it a hip hop record is a little too simple, because I don't think he's even trying to just create hip hop music, because you have people like Bon Iver on the record, you have samples from like King Crimson, you have gospel, you got rock, you got orchestra, you got baroque, you got electronic, you got pianos, auto tune. Like I think he kind of wanted to make a record that was almost like an equivalent of like a Marvel movie. It's like all these elements come together. It's on a big extravagant scale. It's an immaculate production, but it's very cinematic. But at the end of the day, it still kind of has a personal touch. And it's odd, because I feel like a lot of artists wouldn't attempt something like this. I mean, to put Bon Iver on a track with Rick Ross and Nicki Minaj, and to kind of sample a folk artist and turn it into this like huge, soulful number, and have these orchestras and these guitar parts. And, it's almost like he's kind of it's like a mixtape, but it has so much cohesiveness, so much conceptualness, so much ambition. It's like, even if there's songs that you're not necessarily quote unquote a huge fan of, like the audacity of just the themes and the compositions, I think really prove that whether you love Kanye or hate Kanye, he's definitely somebody who is transcending and subverting the conventions of modern music, whether you agree with that or not. And Dark Fantasy, I think, to me, the biggest reason why it's still being talked about like we are tonight is that no matter what you think of it, it could only have been made by Kanye West.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. No, I don't think really there's any other artist I could think of that could make an album this grand and big sounding. I do agree that this is not really just strictly a hip hop rap album. I think Kanye really pushed the boundaries of what hip hop could be. He basically just stretched it out to see, like, hip hop could sound like this. It could sound like a very artistic and musical project. Just adding on all these different influences too, like the whole Baroque kind of thing. It's like you think of like Mozart or Beethoven or Bach, like with all these different Baroque composers, and you add that into hip hop, and it's just shows the capabilities of how it could sound. It doesn't have to just strictly sound like this. It can sound like this. Like, you could add all these different production elements and influences and genres into it too. Also, to agree with the whole thing about adding all these different types of artists into the songs too. Yeah, the Bon Iver, Justin Vernon feature definitely was completely, you wouldn't expect that.
Yeah, and it put him on the map too.
Exactly. Yeah, he's some folk artists basically. For example, the one he's featured on, like Lost in the World, that's just a very chaotic song, which is very grand, choruses, like literally like chants and sirens like blasting in your ear left and right and stuff.
Very anthemic. I mean, it's almost kind of like you could hear this to be like the closing for a film. It's like very much that.
Yeah, basically it is like the outro to the album, and just you end it in a bang, summarizing, culminating all the messages and sounds of this album ends with that, basically. So it's a perfect ending to that album, really.
Yeah, and I think another thing you mentioned is about how like operatic it feels. I think All of the Lights is another key track, I think, that symbolizes how different this record is from a lot of records, because that's a song that's like, the chorus, the strings, the Elton John piano, the amount of people on it. It's like this big, glossy, orchestral, anthemic number. And it's not a hip hop song where it's like typically you hear like snares and beats and it's about, more like lyrics. This is a song more about like, sensations and, textures and arrangements. And that to me kind of realized that this wasn't a record just about, oh, we want to have a good beat or a good lyric. We want to create an experience. And I think that that's something that, whether or not it's your personal taste or not, I mean, it definitely delivers something.
Yeah, that's true. Even with a song like that, it doesn't feel like a hip hop song, really. It's just, I would just describe it as art. really, in a
Oh,
sense,
and
yeah,
definitely,
it's
man.
just
Capital
art.
A,
And
capital R, capital T.
yeah, I was reading like all the people who were featured on that track, like Rihanna, Kid Cudi, Fergie, yeah, Elton John is on there
Yeah,
too, Alicia
crazy.
Keys, Drake, Charlie Wilson. There's a lot of people just in that single track alone, which is, you get all these different styles in there, and then you just kind of, you know, create this kind of song, which is just blends all their strengths and styles in there, and you kind of just get art, really, you know.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. I think it's interesting. Comparing the two, we talked about the influence and the impact and the experience. In terms of which record, so obviously we're both big fans of music, and in terms of which record you personally identified with, or which record you kind of had more of a personal reaction to, what was your individual reaction to kind of when you heard each record for the first time as like a music fan? What was kind of like your reaction to the two? Like, oh man, like what was like the impact you think it had on you as a listener?
Like initially, whenever I listen to a very anticipated album or album I'm looking forward to, especially from artists that I really love their music, I always think, let me listen to this again. So just
Yeah,
right from
I
the
do the
get
same thing
go.
too. First impressions aren't always the best with albums. Some albums I loved the first time, and I don't like them anymore. And some
Yeah.
records I didn't like at all the first time, but I like a lot more.
But I think personally for me, it's just, I'm just digesting a lot of stuff from this album. So I'm just like,
Mhm.
okay, I ran through this album one time. I need to listen to it again so I could just clear my mind a bit and just think like, okay, I just went through this album. Maybe I
Mhm.
missed something or a few things, but I just need to hear what it is again.
Totally get this.
That's
Totally
just
do the same thing too.
my whole method to listening to newly released albums. To me personally, when I listen to these albums, it's just, there's so much to like digest that I
Yeah,
just
you got to make sure
yeah,
you absorb all of it. You know, there's a lot of layers. Yeah, I get that. Especially when
exactly.
you're anticipating something, you got to make sure like you actually like it. It's not just like the hype. It's like, oh, this is great, even though you've only heard like 5 seconds of the title track.
Exactly. I think from these two albums, personally, it clicked with me, you know, after the third or fourth listen. And yeah, just kind of, I really enjoyed those albums, you know, from the get go in a way. So
Totally, man. I mean, I think when I first heard Dark Fantasy, I actually it took me a little while to listen to it for the first time. I think I knew it was out, and then I finally heard it, and I was really struck by it pretty quickly. I was really impressed because right before that I'd heard a lot of Kanye's earlier stuff. I'd heard all his records, but Dark Fantasy was something else. I mean, it took me a little bit of time to realize what he was fully going for, but I think once I got through a couple of listens like you did, I realized like, wow, he was really trying to put every influence, every artistic impulse, every indulgence, like every ambition into one record. And I think most of the time it succeeds. I mean, it does throw a lot at you. It's stuffed to the gills, but I think it succeeds largely at making the viewer kind of feel like they've been immersed in something, or the listener rather. I think that definitely. And in terms of Pimp a Butterfly, I think right away I knew this was going to be a masterpiece record if we were going to talk about, because it's just so like vital and raw and passionate, and just the sound of it is just, it startled me. It was surprising, it was fresh, but it's also classic. I mean, you don't really get records like that a lot, and it's definitely a once in a lifetime thing to hear something that's a classic from the first track on the first listen, in my
Oh
opinion.
yeah, definitely. I could say that maybe Dark Twisted Fantasy is more accessible in a way. To Pimp a Butterfly has, yeah, just from the sound and from the messages, you need to really sit down and tune in and focus on
Mhm.
each song in a
Oh, for
way,
sure,
and to
for sure.
fully grasp, you know, the whole message, you know, the whole recurring theme in that album, recurring motive in that album is like at the end of each song, like Kendrick Lamar would recite a snippet of what would be a poem. At
Right, yeah.
like after one song, it will cut off. Next song or two songs later, he would say a few more lines of this poem, and then by the end of the album, he fully recites it. And just having to see, fully understand the messages that he's conveying in the poem, and then tying in the messages of the songs and saying it's basically
Mhm.
his views of, you know, society and how it impacts, you know, people of color, and the whole socioeconomic impact it has on their lives. And specifically in that case, it's growing up in the hood and then having to escape the hood if you escape it, you don't have to fall into the traps and, temptations that a lot of people in those environments fall into.
Definitely.
That kind of goes along with the whole even title of the album, To Pimp a Butterfly, where it's like, for the butterfly to leave the hood in a sense, which is the cocoon. There's a whole thing about caterpillars, basically, which is basically them just growing up in the hood, just like any average, person who lives there. And then just having to break free from there, not have fallen into temptations or be trapped in a way, just try to escape. It all ties in with the message too. And basically, if you look at the album in a way, it's him, like as you could see from the last track, Mortal Man, it's basically him having a conversation with Tupac.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's like the biggest twist in the end, when I remember hearing that album for the first time, was having to go through that and to the end, and then he's talking to someone, and then you hear Tupac's voice. I'm like, wait, what? What's going on here? And then it's just like, and then you just hear it's like, an excerpt from an interview he had, but the way they edit it to be him having a conversation with him,
it's brilliant.
It's very genius like, in a way. It's like, who would think to really have like, hey, I'm gonna create this album with all these messages about society and empowerment, and I'm gonna have a conversation in the end as if I were talking with Tupac, and this was, a conversation we're having. These are like, you just don't think of that, really.
No, you're not.
Usually it's not something people do, but Kendrick Lamar is different, and he wanted to do that, obviously. So that's just a crazy way how you could, tie in one very historical, influential figure like Tupac, and then just shows how he could still be tied into today's issues and society, how his message, Tupac's message back then when he was alive, is still relevant today too.
Oh, like tremendously so.
Passing one figure to the other with their messages. That's basically that. It's just how it's crazy how it just kind of ties in all these messages. And To Pimp a Butterfly is just like a very heavy record, and there's so many layers and messages that you just need to digest and listen to, really, to fully grasp really what is being said on the album.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that the Tupac conversation, the poetry, the societal themes, and the commentary and the subtext. I mean, it's a record. I think that between the two, Dark Fantasy has a lot of subtext, but I think it's also a record that, I mean, it could be more considered superficial because it is an album about excess, and I think that, on the surface, it does kind of have its themes a bit more subtly layered through. Pimp a Butterfly is maybe a little more overt in those themes, but also for more of a direct purpose. I mean, it's tough to decide which record has more to say, because I think they both have quite a bit to unpack and dissect, and a lot of themes you could spend hours and hours and days analyzing. But I think Pimp Butterfly, I think the one reason why it's like considered so Nobel Peace Prize worthy is that I think it's a record ultimately about the human experience. I mean, if you strip away, the talks about race, and you strip about the hip hop context, it's all about individuals trying to navigate a system, navigate society, navigate the world, and make sure that they maintain their identity throughout it. And I think Dark Fantasy also kind of explores that theme in a more abstract manner. They're both records about identity, men living in America and the American dream, and about the cost of chasing it, and how that cost affects both individuals. And ultimately, they're both, you can consider one a cautionary tale and one kind of more about a beacon of hope. Depending on who you are, you can decide for yourself which one means which.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I do like that point you say, how it kind of pinpoints the experience of like living in America. Like you said, with Dark Twisted Fantasy, it's kind of the American dream and kind of chasing the excess of life in a way, the consequences you have to deal with, that kind of stuff, and the triumphs too. And then obviously with To Pimp a Butterfly, it's the whole experience of growing up in America, if you're of a different color, different socioeconomic class, falling for like the institutions that are instilled in society too, or just learning how just to navigate through that or manage to live through all that stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. They're very similar records and very different records, and that they're both about our relationship to society and our relationship with how our identity gets molded by it. I think Kendrick's is all about how he's trying to escape violence and corruption and impoverished conditions in order to create a better life for himself, but he's also wondering about the side effects of leaving that environment and how he can reconcile with the past. And Kanye's record is all about, him obliterating the line between his public and private personas and kind of a danger of what if he gets too lost in that mirage. And they both have messages about identity and society and about our relationships to them and how they get affected. I mean, the expressions are both very bold, very ambitious, very different types. One's a more grandiose perspective, one's a more down-to-earth approach. But I mean, both are, I think, succeed in becoming, I think, the most personal records either artist has put out, I think, in their discography.
Yeah, I could agree with that too. Personal for Kendrick because, from what it relates from his own experiences and what was going on in the world around that time. And then for Kanye too, like I said before, is him being a pariah to society and then just talking about falling from grace in a way and then just recapturing that and being at the top again.
Yeah, definitely. I think that they're both very reflective of circumstances and current cultural movements. I think there's one aspect of these two records I'd love to talk about, and that's obviously they're both critically acclaimed. They're both very much recognized by purists of the genres as being very much noteworthy releases. Mm-hmm. In terms of the critical response and in terms of how people have been approaching these records, which record do you think has aged better since the release? Like, which of the two records would you say hold up a bit more in terms of where it stands culturally and critically at the moment?
I'll say it's a Pimp a Butterfly right now, at least.
I'd say so too, yeah.
What we said before, it's just the records with its message just still relevant today. Release an album in any past decade and it would still hold truth and reality is still the same from those messages too. Yeah, I think really that album is the one that, still is relevant or has, really the bigger message, really.
Yeah, I think so too. I think in terms of musically, I think it may be a little less extravagant than Dark Fantasy, but I think the themes, the storytelling, and the concepts have a lot more, I think, current accessibility. I think that Dark Fantasy might be a record that might be, quote unquote, easier to listen to because it may not be as obviously heavy, as you said before. But I think in terms of the cultural significance, I think Pimp a Butterfly has escalated rapidly. And it's funny because Kendrick put out a record after that. And, Damn is a great record. But I think Pimp a Butterfly seems to be the one that has a shirt on as well. I mean, no bias on that one. I like Damn is a good record, but I think Pimp a Butterfly is obviously has always been a bigger cultural touchstone.
I think still To Pimp a Butterfly will be that record that solely will stick out really more in the long term will have a more significant impact on society and music too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tight neck race. I mean, in terms of one of the questions I want to bring up is in terms of which record, if we had to kind of class the two records together, kind of do like a side by side, and each records had to kind of box per se or had to kind of fight, which record do you think is making it out? I mean, it's a tough choice. They're both masterpieces. They both sparked a lot of conversation. But if you had to pick one as a record you were taking away, which one is it going to be?
I wouldn't. I would say this boxing match ends in a draw.
Ends in a draw? You think so? You wouldn't be able to make a choice?
That's a tough choice, in my opinion, really. As a whole, To Pimp a Butterfly really is perfect, really flows well with one another. All the songs are tied in so perfectly. Dark Twisted Fantasy, all those songs, you can't, even the song that I don't like the most on that album is still a good song, really.
Oh yeah. What song is that? You don't like that one? This one is not the contender.
So Appalled.
Yeah, that one. I think
and then when I was re-listening to this album, I was thinking, wait, this song is good. Why? It's just not my most favorite, but
yeah. Yeah, I get
but it just tells you as a whole for Dark Twisted Fantasy, and it's quality wise, it's just strong quality songs. Really, you can't really, he really did not miss on any song on here. So
no, definitely not.
but man, I like I yeah, like I said, it would be a draw really between
It'd be a
these
draw.
albums.
It'd be a draw.
They're so good in their own ways that you can't really just say this one would win over this one. Both these albums really push the boundaries of hip hop.
Oh,
You listen to these albums, you don't really think of hip hop in a way, really, or it's not for just the common listener. Just
no,
to
not at all.
these albums
Not at
either.
all.
I wouldn't know what to choose really
What to
between one
choose.
or the
Yeah.
other. Yeah. So
I mean, I get that. I definitely had a hard time breaking it down. I mean, I broke down both records separately, and I had a tough time deciding which one I wanted to choose in this metaphor because I wasn't going to ask a question I didn't have an answer to myself. But I mean, as you talked about, Dark Fantasy is just a game changer of a record. I mean, immaculate production. I mean, just a musical odyssey and just like a balls to the wall, just extravaganza that, sees Kanye come for the other side. And it's definitely the hip hop concept album to kind of match hip hop concept records too. But Pimp the Butterfly is just a social document, an artistic statement. I mean, a cultural touchstone and really a piece of poetry and literature in a lot of ways too. So I had a tough time, but I think if I had to choose one, I think I'd have to choose Pimp a Butterfly just due to the personal subject matter,
totally.
just how it kind of ties into real world struggles a bit more accurately and authentically, and just the fact that I think Kendrick really gives up so much of his soul in these songs and really goes to places that are vulnerable and intimate and introspective. But I mean, I have to give it to Kanye too. I mean, his artistry and his vision and his imagination are just, at the highest peak of his craft and command. So I mean, it's hard for me to choose too. I mean, this answer could change tomorrow, but I mean, if I had to choose, it'd be Pimp. But they're both diamonds in the jewel case, so to speak.
Yeah, you're right. With To Pimp a Butterfly, like Kendrick Lamar, like talked about things that were, deeply personal. One song comes to mind is "You."
Yeah, that's a
very
highlight for me,
personal.
sure.
Took a deep dive into his like family, the impacts of him being, famous and not being there for certain events in life, his guilt about missing out on, things in life. Black or the Berry is like a song that really sticks out too. That we
Definitely. Yeah, I
should
mean, just the
talk
anger in it
about.
and the
Yeah,
emotion.
it's like very angry, charged, political charge. If Black Lives Matter were a song, it would be The Black or the Berry, because it basically
Yeah.
is like, yeah, Black lives really don't matter to people. We're Black, we're dark. It's seen as ugly to society. I want to say like another theme in that To Pimp a Butterfly is really just to love oneself for being Black.
Yeah. Empowerment is a big one,
It's like,
definitely.
love yourself really. Where it's usually in society that, darker skinned people aren't really seen as beautiful, or everyone prefers to be whitewashed really, because people see the ideal of beauty as, something more lighter skinned or white basically. And there are a lot of people who like develop a lot of like self-hate because of the way they just look. Some songs on here like, yeah, Black or the Berry, Complexion.
Complexion was a highlight, yeah.
It's about
Very deep into that.
self-love really, like love yourself, love your skin, love your hair, love everything about yourself that may some people, or how society has portrayed as like not the ideal beauty, but this is who you are. You need to love yourself because, society isn't always right about things. So
No, definitely not. Definitely not these days, especially. That's another episode too. And yeah, I think both those tracks, I think, cut to the core of what the record really is about. It's about identity and empowerment and about ultimately love and perseverance. I think both those songs are very similar because they are different in ways. I mean, the emotions in Black and the Berry, it's angry, it's raw, it's visceral. Complexion is a lot more hopeful, which is almost uncharacteristically hopeful for an album like Pimp a Butterfly. But yeah, I mean, both those tracks I think really encapsulate it. I think with Dark Fantasy, as you were saying, like tracks like Lost in the World and tracks like Title Track, I mean, they really encapsulate the themes too about these extremes and the two extremes you can kind of sit at as an individual. You could be at the highest level of like fame and indulgence, but also feel lost and isolated. So I think both records are managed to kind of make very big, broad points, but do a very good job of identifying those points musically and thematically, I would say.
Yeah, of course, totally.
I mean, there's so much to talk about here. I'm almost wondering, the biggest question I have is which one do we think is going to be the record that going forward is going to continue to dominate most of the conversation?
I think it really just depends on what you're talking about, really. If you're going for a standard of how music could sound and how big something could sound, or how conceptually messages and an album could sound, I would say Dark Twisted Fantasy, because like he just really reached like some high point of like how, like I said, how music could sound, and just kind of set a standard for goals to be achieved and peaks to achieve. But if we're talking about, impactful records based on message and, themes, I would say would be To Pimp a Butterfly, really. So.
Oh yeah, definitely too. I think as a lyrical record, as a feat of storytelling, I mean, From a Butterfly, I think is the golden standard for records since its time. And I think in terms of just diving into the sonic boundaries of how experimental and how avant-garde hip hop or music in general can be. I mean, Dark Fantasy is kind of like a great pop record, a great electronic record, a great rock. I mean, it's just every genre of music kind of finds its way into that record, and somehow it still sounds like Kanye. So yeah, I mean, both of them I think are going to be big parts of a discussion going forward. They still are, thankfully, and I think that people, even years and years after they release, I think people are going to look at these as really being historic achievements on how to rewrite a genre in one's own image, for sure.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely. Like I said, really changed the way that how a hip hop album could sound. Push the boundaries on it. I agree with you. It's, people look back on it and think that, yeah, these are really two albums that really were released in a specific time that shook things up, really.
Oh yeah,
changed the whole landscape of how artists produce their own albums and how it sounds and whatever messages they want to convey in there. It just shook things up, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess as we're nearing kind of our final thoughts on each record, how would you describe ultimately the experience of listening to both records? And how would you, I know, because I asked you earlier, like we were kind of comparing and contrasting which record we liked more, but ultimately, which one would you say left you, I think, more emotionally engaged, would you say, if you had to pick?
I'll say this, with my Dark Twisted Fantasy, it kind of like pumped me up in a way, because everything on that album is like very anthemic in a way. Let's just say that you have songs like Power, Monster, Runaway, Devil in a New Dress.
A lot of energy in those songs.
All the Lights, even Dark Fantasy, the opening track, Lost in the. A lot of these songs really pump you up in a way, even if it's like not supposed to for some, but it's kind of hard to avoid it being a song that you could just blast in your car or in your room, or anything that just pumps you up in a way. So that's how I felt whenever I listen to my Dark Twisted Fantasy. Pimp a Butterfly definitely is an album that makes me reflect more, take a seat back from whatever I'm doing today, or what is in my mind, or whatever I'm thinking about, and just having to reflect on like, damn, this stuff still going on in society, is happening. There's a whole cycle of repetition for things, and it really just explains what's going on in the world today and in the past, and I would still say the future, really. But yeah, each of these albums really convey like different emotions and moods, really. So it's kind of, I'll just leave it at that. It just kind of they're two different sides of like a yin and yang side. One is the stronger end, one is the more receptive, reflective end, really. So
yeah, I mean, that's kind of my take is that I think one is definitely an album that's kind of gorging on the feast of ideas and the feast of sounds, and one is more about the sheer depth of the emotions it can convey. And I think that ultimately, if I had to pick which one, I think I kind of had more of an emotional attachment to. I mean, I would definitely go with Pimp. I think that kind of seems to be the consensual answer for a lot of this video. But I mean, it's just a record, I think, that like you were saying, I mean, it reflects on so much. It's like where we've been, where we are and where we're going. But I think that it has such a humanity and hope to it that even though it's a dark, gritty, heavy record, I mean, it's got such a beauty and a humanity to it that I think that'll never, I think, not be relevant.
There's some songs on To Pimp a Butterfly I would listen to alone, but I feel like whenever I listen to this album, I need to listen to it from top to bottom in
Me
sequence. There isn't really like a song that really I would just pull out and listen to alone. I mean, on the other hand, Dark Twisted Fantasy, I could just pull out any song and it just like, flip my room upside down basically. So it's like basically, or just like I put on, if I'm in the car driving and then a Dark Twisted Fantasy song pops up, I'm like, okay, I'm turning this up, just
you extend the drive by 30 minutes, you doing the lap on the block. I get it. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point too. I mean, as an album, I think Pimp is so constructed to be kind of like a book, chapters. You have to read each one to get the meaning of the other. But Dark Fantasy is almost kind of like a buffet. It's like you grab from one table or another, but they all kind of complement the dish. I mean, yeah, that's a great take.
Mm-hmm.
As we're nearing our final thoughts, is there anything else you'd like to discuss or explore? I mean, we've covered a lot about this record. I feel like we can go on and on and on, but there's I think we'd have like,
let me see. I would say on Dark Twisted Fantasy, it's loaded with features, and I would say a lot of the featured artists, I would say they delivered some of their best verses.
Yeah, the features are great.
Career. Like Nicki Minaj on Monster, that's still a very iconic verse. During that time, she was like up and coming, and then she delivers this crazy verse where she has like 3 different personas going on. Like
at least 3.
At least 3, yeah. She's just like the way she just switches from one to the other, switching through the personas. Great verse from her. Rick Ross on Devil in a New Dress. That's probably my favorite song on this album, Devil.
Yeah, that's my favorite. I was gonna say that's the one I
just the whole, like the very soulful sample. Like I did some research on it. Like apparently he sampled like a Smokey Robinson song.
I've heard that too.
Yeah, great. And then just the whole interlude in the middle with like Mike Dean with that guitar solo just adds a lot of emotion and character to the song. And yeah, Rick Ross, he just delivered one of his best verses of his career too. Just a lot of lines on there you just remember.
Oh yeah, a lot of quotables.
A lot of quotables, just flows so smoothly through it. Pusha T definitely had one of his best verses too on Runaway. Flow and rhyme scheme, and it's like that whole song, you can remember so many things from that. Pusha T sounds really great on anything that was related to Kanye, of course. Kid Cudi on Gorgeous, that's such a
great
iconic hook too, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, no, excellent hook.
Yeah,
excellent
too. Exactly. And
great guitar on that song too.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's also adds into the whole things about what I mentioned before, how even when the songs on Dark Twisted Fantasy seem like they're gonna be done, there's a whole outro and just a little gift at the end with like those musical interlude outros and stuff. Like like the guitar solo at the end of Gorgeous, or the Runaway. The song I forgot to mention is Hell of a Life. I think that was like probably my favorite song when I first listened to it, because just the whole like Iron Man, Black Sabbath sample, in terms of the production, it literally is all over the place. A lot of adrenaline is pumping through your mind when you listen to that song.
It's so dark and gothic and ominous and twisted. I think it really is like the title of the record. I mean, it's encapsulated in just the sounds of that song. So yeah, I really like the feature point you brought up. And now something, when I listened to the record, I really did look at the features a lot as well. And I mean, Nicki Minaj with that monster verse, just a phenomenal, like breakneck, go for broke verse that really established her as a talent. I mean, Devil in a New Dress, another gorgeous song, a soul influence, a rock influence. And I think every feature that he brings here, I think complements the record. I mean, I think feature heavy records can really be kind of undone, or it can be at best, it can be kind of like fun and exciting. At the worst, it kind of drags down the album. But the features here, I think each artist is tapped for their particular strengths and suits. It's almost like a universe. Like all these characters are kind of like actors in a play, and they're all kind of playing a role that kind of brings out the themes and the texture and the mood of these songs. And everybody here really is utilized in a manner that really makes it significant. You know, no one here is wasted.
And exactly. Yeah. Even if it's a very little contribution, that little contribution really makes a lot. It stands out a lot for each individual song.
Oh, for sure.
I feel like with this album, just everyone just delivered. Whoever was featured on there,
Definitely, man.
they brought their A game basically. So yeah.
Oh yeah. Especially that Nicki Minaj and Rick Ross feature. I definitely was a big fan. And Pusha T on Runaway. I mean, phenomenal song. Arguably the best track on the record. I mean, beautiful verse, definitely.
Yeah. Even Jay-Z on Monster too. That was like a great verse from him too.
Yeah.
And even Rick Ross on the intro. Like that whole song in general had a lot of great features. Just
that song is still a pump up song 10 years later, 10, 11 years later. That song still is in the rotation. no doubt about it. I mean, I think to finish it off and top it off, I mean, these are both, I think, two landmark records. I think they both elevated the conversation in music. I think that they found a new language to kind of paint the genre in. I think that there's so much these records cover, so many themes, so many ideas, so many guest artists. And I think that what makes both these records classics, what makes both these records, I think, substantial is that at the end of the day, these aren't just records that are put out to just have good songs or have good features. They're chronicling human experience, but they're also doing so in a manner that transcends their genres. And I think that regardless of which one you think is better, or if you can't choose, or which one admires your sensibility, these records are definitely game changers. And I think two of the most important pieces of pop culture we have. And I'm thankful that we have them both.
Same here. Yeah. Great pieces of music and pop culture. I don't know how things would sound like if they weren't here, really, in a way.
Oh, yeah.
It would be very different. Yeah.
For sure. Absolutely. Well, man, thank you so much for joining me on this chat. I mean, it was a thrill to dive into these records. It's been something I've been on my list for a long time.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm glad to that we got this chance to discuss these two records right here. So yeah, definitely a lot has been said about it because there's so many things you could say about both of them.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, man. I hope you guys enjoyed this segment and let us know what you think.
Yeah, same here. Yeah.
Have a good one, bud.
Thanks, you too.